August 1943, somewhere on the black volcanic slopes of New Georgia. The jungle breathes heavy rain drips from broad leaves, pooling in foxholes and rotting boots. A squad of U.S. Marines lies prone beneath tangled roots, their khaki uniforms dark with sweat and red clay. Each man clutches something the textbooks never imagined for jungle war, a 12-gauge Winchester shotgun. Its short barrel blackened, its stock slick with humidity, 5 rounds of double-aught buckshot, each shell the size of a man's thumb, rest in the tube at 30 feet. It can shred a body before the echo fades. The squad waits Japanese scouts had been spotted moving through the ravine below, the perfect place for an ambush. A hand signal flashes. Thumbs tense over the steel safeties, then the jungle erupts, a chain of thunderclaps. Buckshot tearing through leaves and men alike for seconds. The world is nothing but recoil, smoke, and the smell of wet powder, but when the echo dies, something's wrong. 2 Marines wrestle with jammed actions, their paper shells swollen by rain. The roar fades, replaced by the rising shout of a counterattack. To understand how such close-range power could also betray its wielders, we have to go back by mid-1943. The Pacific War had become a contest of exhaustion. What began at Pearl Harbor as a lightning offensive was now grinding through heat, rot, and coral. Each island taken by the Americans became a laboratory of improvisation. A new set of problems no training manual had anticipated. The maps looked simple. 1. Jungle-covered mass after another, but the ground was alive with mosquitoes, thorns, and invisible men with Arisaka rifles on Guadalcanal. Marines had learned that range mattered less than reflex in the dark. Enemies appeared 5 yards away, sometimes 3. The elegant Springfield rifles carried from stateside ranges were too long. Their bolts too slow. Submachine guns were scarce, and the first batches of the new M1 Thompson were still being rationed to Raider units, so quartermasters reached back into the forgotten corners of storage depots for an older weapon that had once terrorized the trenches of France. The 12-gauge combat shotgun. The decision was practical, not romantic. The Army and Marine Corps already owned thousands of Winchester and Remington trench guns left over from 1918. They were short, brutal, and simple. Pump-action repeaters with bayonet lugs and ventilated heat shields. Each pull of the trigger sent 9 lead pellets, each roughly .33 caliber, in a fist-sized pattern that could wipe out a foxhole at point-blank range in the claustrophobic terrain of the Pacific. That pattern meant survival, but the environment these weapons entered was nothing like the dry plains of France here. Every cartridge was an invitation for decay, humidity soaked into paper-hulled shells, swelling them until they refused to chamber salt air-corroded metal faster than men could oil it. Even the weapon's famed reliability could not conquer nature's chemistry. Still, to the men who fought at night among banyan roots and razor grass, a shotgun felt like an anchor of certainty, the one weapon that did not depend on luck or marksmanship. When the enemy was 10 paces away, the Japanese, too, adapted to the same suffocating conditions. They fought from spider holes and coral caves, forcing every engagement to collapse into hand-to-hand violence. Grenades, knives, bayonets, and shotguns became the vocabulary of these duels. Every hill seized on Guadalcanal or New Georgia was paid for. In inches, ambushes flared without warning. The line between hunter and hunted shifted by the minute out of these experiences. The shotgun's reputation spread quietly through the ranks. Marine raiders, jungle infantry, and Navy patrol craft crews all requested them. Winchester's Model 12, with its smooth slam-fire action, became the favorite. Its barrel was only 20 inches long, easy to swing in tight cover, and it could empty 5 shells in less than 2 seconds. If the trigger were held down while the action was pumped at close range, it was unmatched. The brass-headed military shells, specially made for tropical climates, performed well, but not every batch was. Brass supply lines still funneled commercial paper shells into the field. their wax coatings softening in the heat by the time of the new Georgia campaign. Each company carried a handful of these guns, usually assigned to scouts, point men, or NCOs leading small patrols. Doctrine was forming in real time. Use the shotgun for ambushes, for cave clearing, for the terrifying instant when visibility collapsed to mere feet. Official reports called them highly effective in jungle fighting. Unofficially, men called them life insurance. Yet, even as the shotgun carved its place in the Pacific arsenal, it carried hidden risks that would surface. Again and again, a single swollen cartridge could turn its advantage into peril. A missed maintenance cycle could jam the action at the exact moment. An ambush unfolded. The weapon that promised certainty lived on the edge of betrayal. And so, while the Marines refined their tactics, learning to move silent, strike fast, and vanish, the shotgun became both symbol and tool of that philosophy. It was brutal, efficient, and intimate, a weapon of breathing distance, but its true story was just beginning. In a series of jungle fights where the terrain, the weapon, and the men would test each other to the limit to grasp how this convergence shaped one of the Pacific's most harrowing firefights. We need to look deeper into the machinery, the logistics, and the human reasoning that made the shotgun both savior and liability. The Winchester Model 12 was more than a shotgun. It was a piece of American engineering philosophy machined from solid steel, hand-fitted and balanced for smooth cycling. It was the kind of weapon a craftsman took pride in. Its pump action could be fired as fast as a man's hand could move, a feature known as slam fire, hold the trigger down, and every pump discharged a shell, turning the gun into a 5-shot thunderclap. No safety switch, no hesitation. In the Pacific, that speed meant the difference between a successful ambush and annihilation. The earlier model, 1897, though older and less refined, was still widely issued. It had an exposed hammer and a rougher action, but it shared the same lethal purpose. Both models were adapted for combat, with shortened 20-inch barrels, bayonet lugs to fit the M1917 sword bayonet, and perforated heat shields to prevent burns from rapid fire. They were rugged, simple, and easy to teach, a weapon even a nervous replacement could master in minutes. War is not fought in ideal conditions, as these guns moved from training fields to tropical hellscapes. Their greatest enemy wasn't human, it was the jungle itself. The Pacific's relentless humidity soaked into every crevice of metal and wood. Paper-hulled shotgun shells, inherited from pre-war civilian stocks, absorbed moisture until they swelled against the chamber walls. When a Marine tried to chamber a round, the shell sometimes stuck halfway, tearing apart or jamming the feed in an ambush. Seconds mattered. That delay could mean death. Ordnance officers soon realized the danger. Reports from Guadalcanal, Macon, and New Britain warned of misfeeds caused by soft, wax-coated hulls, brass shell. Variants performed better, but were harder to mass-produce and heavier to ship. By 1943, efforts were underway to coat the paper shells with extra wax and waterproof varnish. But the results were inconsistent. Some batches arrived perfect, others melted under the Pacific sun before reaching the front. Men adapted as best they could. Shotgun operators learned to rotate their ammunition daily, wiping each shell with an oily rag and keeping them wrapped in waxed paper or dry socks. Patrol leaders carried spare brass shells for reliability, saving them for the first few seconds of an ambush, when everything depended on a flawless start. Improvisation became doctrine. Despite the headaches, the shotgun remained beloved in confined jungle or cave combat. Its power was unmatched. A burst of double-aught buckshot could shred a line of charging soldiers before they could bring a rifle to bear. The psychological impact was immense. Japanese soldiers who had grown up on rifle marksmanship found the sudden roar and spread of pellets devastating. Even demoralizing. Captured diaries occasionally mentioned the thunder weapon. or the shotgun that kills all, at 10 yards. There was no armor or body position that could stop it yet to American leadership. The shotgun was never more than a specialized tool, not a frontline standard. It required constant care. Its range was short, and it burned through ammunition quickly. Each 12-gauge shell weighed far more than a .30-06 cartridge, limiting how many a soldier could carry. A full bandolier of 20 shells was heavy. More than 40 became a burden, so shotguns were assigned in small numbers, often carried by scouts, radiomen, or NCOs who might encounter sudden contact in these dense environments. Doctrine evolved daily. Manuals began to recommend that patrols mix shotguns with automatic rifles or Thompsons, using each weapon for its specific niche: the rifle for distance, the automatic for suppression, the shotgun for ambush and assault. This blend defined the Marine style of jungle warfare: aggressive, flexible, and painfully personal. Back in the United States, ordnance engineers followed the reports with keen interest. They sought to understand the relationship between technology and terrain. They learned that a weapon's effectiveness was not just in its design, but in the unseen chain of logistics behind it: the right materials, the right coatings, the right storage. Every jammed shotgun in a New Georgia ravine was, in truth, a failure of industry as much as battle. By 1944, newer shell casings began to use improved waterproofing, but for the Marines still clearing ridges and ravines, those lessons arrived too late. They continued to fight with the weapons and ammunition they had, trusting them with their lives, yet never fully forgetting how a single swollen shell could turn victory into chaos. From these intertwined struggles, mechanical, environmental, and human, emerged the legend of the Pacific shotgun: powerful, brutal, and unpredictable. It was a weapon made for ambushes, for the sudden explosion of violence at zero range, and soon, on one small, rain-soaked island, that legend would be tested in a firefight, where the shotgun's strength and weakness collided head-on. Were in the jungle was not fought in sweeping maneuvers or map arrows. It was fought in breaths, in the soft rustle of a sleeve against wet leaves, in the heartbeat before a trigger broke. For the Marines who carried shotguns, combat felt intimate, uncomfortably, so they could smell their enemy before they saw him. They could feel the concussive wave of their own blasts rebound off the tree trunks. A rifleman fought an enemy he might never clearly see. A shotgunner saw the whites of eyes. Many who wielded these weapons were veterans of earlier campaigns: Guadalcanal, Tulagi, or Macon. They knew that in the jungle, visibility vanished within yards. A shotgun wasn't just a tool. It was emotional armor. Its weight reassured, its bark terrified. Every pump of the action was a declaration of life. I am still here, yet this proximity left scars. When a shotgun killed, it did so with shocking violence. Bodies were torn open, shredded by dozens of pellets. Even hardened soldiers admitted to looking away afterward. In later interviews, a few confessed they stopped counting how many they had killed, because you don't shoot people with a shotgun, you erase them. This was the unseen cost of jungle warfare, a kind of dehumanization born not from hatred, but survival to live. A Marine had to become as ruthless as the weapon in his hands. Jungle combat was geometry stripped of distance. Everything depended on positioning, sound, and timing. Ambush were not spontaneous chaos. They were calculated traps. Before a patrol set an ambush, its leader would study the terrain like a carpenter measuring grain. Which way does the wind blow? Where will the enemy's eyes fall first? Where can a man crouch unseen, yet still aim down a sightline 10 yards long? The jungle, thick with vines and mud, turned tactics into craftsmanship. The shotgun excelled here. Its cone of fire made aiming forgiving, a lifesaver in low visibility. A 5-man element might set up in a staggered L formation along a trail, overlapping arcs of fire to create a lethal funnel. The point man's shotgun opened the trap. Automatic rifles followed with suppression. Grenades finished what buckshot began, but ambush doctrine required nerves of ice. The men had to wait until the enemy was inside the kill zone, often 20 feet or less, before firing too early. And the enemy scattered. Too late, and he was on top of them. Every man's finger trembled over the trigger guard. Listening to the slow approach of boots and whispers, when the order came, usually a hand signal, or whispered now, the effect was cataclysmic. Shotguns roared first, their blasts flattening the front line, the smell of cordite mixed with jungle rot. Leaves shredded by buckshot, echoing thunder trapped under the canopy, within seconds. The ambush site transformed into chaos, but the success of these operations depended entirely on the opening seconds. If even one gun jammed, if one man hesitated, the ambushers risked becoming the ambushed. In that delicate balance, the shotgun was both savior and liability. At the heart of every shotgun lay simple physics and brutal truth. Each 12-gauge shell carried 9 lead pellets, each weighing roughly 1/8 of an ounce when fired. Those pellets spread into a pattern about the width of a man's torso at 10 yards. At that distance, it was impossible to miss. At 20, the pattern widened, still deadly, but less certain. Beyond 40 yards, the pellets lost much of their energy. The weapon became little more than noise. This made the shotgun a paradox. It was devastating up close, nearly useless beyond. It punished poor logistics, too heavy, too limited in range, yet rewarded courage. It demanded a man's step toward danger, not away from it. Manufacturers tried to refine it for war. The heat shield prevented burns from rapid cycling. The bayonet lug turned it into a hybrid of firearm and spear. The brass shell casing solved part of the moisture problem, though not all. Tests by ordnance officers recorded consistent failures. When shells were left exposed to rain for more than a day, even the slam fire feature, beloved by Marines, increased the risk of accidental discharge if handled carelessly under stress. Still, technology bowed to necessity. In terrain where rifles fouled with mud and submachine guns jammed from grit, the shotgun's pump action often kept working. Its simplicity became its genius. It did not need precision engineering or delicate parts, only a steady hand and enough courage to close the distance. That simplicity, though, hit its limits as battles raged deeper into the Pacific. Those limits would collide with human determination, producing moments of triumph and others of catastrophe in the Pacific. Leadership rarely came from polished doctrine. It was written in mud, sweat, and guesswork. Every island required a new rulebook. Officers learned faster than any textbook could teach, often through failure. By 1943, Marine commanders had begun to grasp the chaotic rhythm of jungle fighting. Their field manuals offered guidance, but the reality was improvisation. Lieutenants and sergeants led by instinct, deciding which weapon, which man, and which moment would turn confusion into control. The shotgun was not an official centerpiece of infantry tactics. It was a supplementary arm, yet, within small unit combat, it became a leader's secret weapon. Platoon commanders often assigned shotguns to scouts, point men, or non-commissioned officers, men trusted to make split-second decisions. A shotgun at the front could shatter an ambush before it formed. Some officers swore by them. Colonel Evans Carlson's raiders carried shotguns during raids on Mackinac Island, praising their effect in close-quarter firefights on Bougainville. Company commanders ordered a handful of shotguns per platoon, particularly for jungle clearing and night defense. Reports noted that morale improved when those weapons were present. Men feel safer with a shotgun in the line. Still, leadership understood their fragility. Commanders reminded troops to keep weapons dry, ammunition sealed, and barrels clear of mud. They ordered the guns stored in oil-soaked rags when not in use, a ritual that bordered on superstition. A jammed shotgun in an ambush could cost more than one life. Leaders carried that weight constantly. For many officers, decisions about the shotgun became a study in balance, firepower versus logistics, Confidence versus caution. Each ambush, each patrol, became a gamble, and leadership was measured not in rank, but in how calmly one could face that gamble. For the Japanese soldiers entrenched across the Pacific, the American shotgun was a terrifying enigma in an army that prized long-range marksmanship and bayonet spirit. The idea of facing a weapon that required neither was disorienting. The first encounters came on Guadalcanal. Japanese patrols stumbled into short-range American ambushes and never understood what had hit them. Survivors described the sound as one continuous explosion, no muzzle flash visible, only a wall of noise and impact at 10 yards. 9 pellets could pass through 2 men. Bodies simply dropped, lifeless before a counterattack could form. Captured diaries from later campaigns on New Georgia and Tarawa mention the shotgun that sprays death, likely references to the Winchester or Remington trench guns, but the Japanese adapted quickly. They began spreading their formations in dense terrain, using scouts ahead of columns to trigger ambushes early. They learned to dig deeper foxholes and conceal behind coral walls, where buckshot lost momentum at night. They attacked from angles that minimized close-range encounters, favoring infiltration and hand grenades for American forces. This adaptation changed everything. Ambush that once worked flawlessly began to fail. The enemy advanced slower, more cautiously, forcing Marines to fire earlier. At greater distance, where the shotgun's power diminished, some patrols found themselves exposed, their element of surprise gone in time. The weapon that had once given psychological advantage became less decisive. Enemy evolution had neutralized part of its terror still. In tight corners, bunkers, tunnels, and caves, the shotgun remained a nightmare weapon. The final word in close-range brutality. Its echo would haunt both sides long after the gunfire ceased. Every weapon tells a story about its user's ethics. The shotgun story was complicated. It carried ghosts from the First World War. When Germany protested its use as inhumane, the U.S. had dismissed the complaint then, citing necessity, yet the stigma lingered in the Pacific. Morality blurred under the canopy. War stripped men of distance, both physical and emotional. There was no room for abstraction when fighting at 10 feet. The shotgun, in that environment, symbolized the collapse of civilized warfare. Efficient, instinctive, and merciless. Officers and chaplains alike wrestled with it. Was it any crueler than a flamethrower or grenade? Probably not, but its intimacy unsettled even the hardened. Many Marines described a strange duality: gratitude for its protection, and revulsion at its aftermath. After firefights, some quietly disassembled their guns, cleaned them in silence, and said nothing. No one glorified the weapon. It was not a symbol of heroism. It was survival made mechanically. History tends to simplify in later years. The shotgun would become a symbol of ingenuity, proof of American adaptability and realism. But within those jungles, it was something far darker, a reminder that victory often demanded acts that haunted the victors. This moral weight shadowed the Pacific campaigns, shaping the veterans who carried it. When the fighting ended, they returned home with memories they rarely spoke of: flashes of thunder, smoke, and eyes that vanished behind the blast. They had survived, but each had left a part of himself somewhere between the trees. The ambush that would bring all these forces, leadership, technology, human frailty, and moral tension, crashing together, was not unique in scale, but in consequence it would begin like hundreds of others, with quiet whispers and leveled barrels, and end in a sudden, terrible reversal. New Georgia, August 1943. The air felt like wet canvas, heavy, suffocating, unbroken by dawn. A thin haze clung to the treetops where the insects never stopped screaming. Somewhere along a narrow ridge west of Barocco Harbor, a Marine patrol from the 25th Regiment was lying in waiting, then tracking a Japanese column moving through the jungle for 2 days. Scouts and porters hauling crates toward the coast. The Marines' orders were simple: intercept, destroy, and withdraw before reinforcements arrived. Ambush like this had become routine. But the terrain turned every routine into a gamble. The trail ahead was only shoulder width, hemmed in by roots, vines, and the green silence that made men hear their own blood at 0600 hours. The squad leader, Staff Sergeant Dale Winfield, gave the signal to dig in. 8 men spread out along the bend of the trail, forming a perfect low-shaped kill zone. The point of the L, 2 men with shotguns, crouched low behind a fallen palm. Their weapons gleamed faintly in the dim light, barrels already slick with oil. Each man carried 20 shells, 10 brass, 10 paper, stuffed into the pouches of an ammunition belt. They had rehearsed the sequence the night before. First volley from shotguns, second from bars, third from grenades. Timing was everything. For 3 hours they waited. The jungle gave nothing back, only heat and gnats. Sweat ran down the back of Winfield's neck, soaking into the collar of his fatigues. He could hear the metallic heartbeat of his own weapon as he thumbed the action open and closed in silence. The men barely spoke. Some chewed hardtack to keep awake. Others just stared into the trees. Then came the sound, faint at first, like water over stones. Voices, a snapping twig, a hint of movement along the trail. Winfield raised his hand, slow, deliberate, and every man froze through the foliage. They could see shapes moving in single file. Japanese soldiers, 8 or 9 of them, rifles slung, relaxed, unaware. The lead man carried a radio pack. Another followed with a Type 92 light machine gun slung over one shoulder. The first Marine shotgunner, Private Leonard Tex McCready, took aim. His thumb slid off the safety. He waited until the column's midpoint reached the bend. The distance, 12 yards perfect. Winfield's hand dropped. The first blast shattered the morning. Roar of the Winchesters drowned the jungle. 2 rounds in half a second. The Model 12s howled like thunder, pumping fire and smoke into the trail. The lead Japanese scout disappeared in a cloud of shredded foliage. Another was thrown backward, his helmet spinning away like a tossed coin. Within seconds, the ambush exploded into chaos. Bars and Garans joined the chorus. Grenades rolled into the underbrush, blooming fire through ferns. The air filled with the smell of cordite, mud, and blood. But amid the thunder, one sound broke rhythm, a hollow metallic clack. McCready's shotgun jammed. The swollen paper shell had ruptured inside the chamber. Locking the action halfway, he slammed the pump forward. Nothing, he cursed, dropped the gun, and reached for his sidearm to his left. The second shotgunner, Corporal Ames, fired 3 rounds before his own weapon seized. Steam rose from the barrel as he tried to pump again. The action stuck fast. Another shell had swollen tight in the heat for a heartbeat. The line hesitated. Their killing rhythm faltered. The Japanese survivors, stunned but not broken, dove off the trail and opened fire. Rifle cracks snapped through the trees. A bar gunner screamed and fell backward, hit through the shoulder. Grenade fragments peppered the fallen palm. Winfield shouted for covering fire. The squad rallied, but the momentum, the vital first seconds of control, was gone. Smoke drifted low, stinging eyes and lungs. Through the haze, figures moved, fast, deliberate, circling the flanks. The ambushers were now being encircled. For every man in that line, time slowed to fragments. Each second became a decision. Fire, move, survive. The shotgun that had promised dominance at 10 yards was now a dead weight, its reliability undone by climate and chemistry. Private McCready managed to clear his jam, ramming the butt of his weapon against a tree, forcing the swollen hull out with a sharp crack. He reloaded with brass shells, the ones kept dry in his sock, and fired point blank as a Japanese soldier lunged from the brush. The blast echoed like cannon fire, cutting the man down at 5 feet. But it was too late to restore the ambush. The enemy was everywhere now, scattered, screaming, firing blind. Winfield's men began to pull back uphill, laying down short bursts, The bars rattled until their barrels glowed orange. Every movement was hindered by mud and vines. Every step risked exposure. A rifle grenade burst against a tree trunk. Showering splinters, 2 Marines fell, one silent, one moaning. The ambush had turned into a running fight, the kind every commander feared most by 0715. The ridge was a chaos of echoes. What had begun as a precise, rehearsed trap had collapsed into confusion. The price of one small malfunction, 2 jammed shotguns, had reversed the balance in less than 30 seconds. Winfield ordered withdrawal toward the river crossing. He moved last, firing bursts from his Thompson to cover the retreat. When they reached the creek bed, only 5 of the original 8 were still moving. The jungle fell silent again. Indifferent birds returned to the trees. Spent shells glimmered in the mud. Paper, brass, and fragments of everything in between. The firefight had lasted less than 15 minutes, but its lessons would echo far longer, through reports, through ordnance memos, through whispered warnings passed between patrols. Keep your shells dry, or they'll betray you. And up the ridge, behind the smoke, the Japanese regrouped, angry, bloodied, alive. They had survived an American ambush and turned it into their own counterattack. The story did not end there. The second phase of that encounter, the desperate retreat and the price of recovery, would decide whether any of Winfield's men made it out alive. The squad scrambled through the underbrush, slipping in the soaked earth. The air was thick with smoke and the echo of rifle fire chasing them downhill. Every man carried something different now. Some their rifles, others only pistols or bandoliers. Winfield stayed at the rear, counting shapes through the haze. 5 no. 4. The bar gutter had gone silent somewhere behind them. They reached the base of the ridge, a shallow ravine, cut by a trickling stream, half choked with reeds. It was their only cover. Winfield signaled them to form a half circle facing the slope they had come from. They had seconds before the enemy followed. McReady crouched behind a root tangle, reloading his shotgun. The brass shells slid in smoothly, a sharp contrast to the swollen paper ones that still littered the trail behind them. He muttered under his breath, not words, just noise, something to keep his hands from shaking. Ames, beside him, checked his own Model 12. He had pried it open with a bayonet tip, ejecting the mangled shell. It would fire again. Maybe the first Japanese soldier appeared through the smoke, cautious, slow, rifle raised. Winfield waited. He didn't yell. He just nodded to McCready. The shotgun fired once. The man collapsed instantly. The echo rolled through the ravine like thunder again. The same sound that had started this ambush, now finishing it. But the enemy didn't stop. 2, 3, 5 figures emerged next, their khaki blending with the undergrowth. Bayonets glinting. Fire erupted from both sides. Bullets tore into tree trunks, sending splinters flying. A grenade bounced off a rock and exploded midair, showering mud across the line. Winfield's Thompson rattled until its last round clicked empty. He ducked, reloaded, and shouted for Ames to shift left. The flank was folding. Ames moved low and fast, his shotgun ready. He fired twice, the weapon bucking hard, and then again, each blast ripping through vines and shadows. But the recoil knocked him off balance, and he fell backward into the mud. Gasping, McReady reached him, dragging him behind the root line. The corporal's left leg was bleeding, shrapnel, deep but not fatal. He pressed a bandage down and went back to firing one shell after another, each ejecting cleanly now, the brass casings gleaming in the dim light. They were holding the line, if only barely. The Japanese regrouped higher up the slope, switching tactics. Instead of rushing headlong, they began to flank, using the ravine walls for cover, moving in short bursts, firing blind. Winfield knew what was coming. They'd try to pin them and close from both sides. He had to break contact before that happened. He crawled toward McCready, shouting over the noise, "Smoke right side, now." McCready yanked the pin on a white phosphorus grenade and tossed it across the ravine. The detonation hissed like boiling water, thick white clouds spilled outward. Swallowing the jungle in seconds, it smelled of burning metal and acid, the kind of smoke that clung to skin and lungs under its cover. The Marines began to pull back once more. One by one, they moved through waist-deep muck. Using roots and vines for balance, the wounded came first, then the gunner's Winfield went last again, counting, always counting behind them. Through the smoke came voices, shouting, angry. Closing in a single rifle shot cracked, hitting a tree just above Winfield's shoulder. He didn't flinch. He turned, fired a 3-round burst into the white void, and kept moving after 50 yards. They reached a small clearing where the jungle opened briefly to a low hill. They stopped there, breathing hard, checking ammunition. McCready had 6 shells left. Winfield had 2 magazines. Ames was pale but conscious. They could hear nothing now but the drip of rain through the canopy. The smoke curtain had worked for the moment. Winfield gathered the survivors in a crouch. "We hold here," he said simply. "If they come, we make it count." He looked around. No heroism, no bravado, just exhaustion and the calm that comes after chaos. Each man understood what it meant. Hold long enough to let the main patrol regroup, or die in place if the enemy found them. First minutes passed. Then an hour. The jungle began to breathe again. No pursuit came. Either the Japanese had pulled back to recover their own, or they were circling for another approach. No one wanted to find out by noon. Winfield made the call. They began moving east toward the extraction point marked on their maps, a coastal inlet 3 miles away. They traveled in silence, weapons slung but ready. Every rustle in the leaves felt like another ambush waiting. The heat returned with full force, pressing against their backs. Their uniforms were soaked through with mud and blood that had already turned black when they finally reached the beach that evening. A Navy patrol boat was waiting. Just as scheduled, the sailors helped them aboard, eyes wide at the sight of the burned, exhausted men. No one spoke for several minutes. Only the steady churn of the boat's engine filled the silence as the island receded into the dusk. McCready stared down at his shotgun. The receiver was scratched, the barrel dented, but it had survived. He pulled a paper shell from his pocket, swollen, soft, ruined by sweat and rain, and tossed it overboard. It sank instantly. Swallowed by the dark. Winfield watched it go, then said quietly, "Sometimes the jungle decides who fires first." No one answered. They just listened to the sea and the soft rattle of spent brass rolling on the deck for the U.S. ordnance officers who later read Winfield's after-action report. The lesson was stark. The shotgun was a weapon of extremes, devastating at point-blank range, but treacherous when moisture and time conspired against it. Its glory and failure were 2 sides of the same coin, and in that paradox, that mix of raw power and fragile mechanics, lay the story of every weapon tested in the Pacific. Beautiful in design, brutal in purpose, and utterly beholden to the environment it tried to conquer. The firefight on New Georgia would go unrecorded in official histories, buried among hundreds of unnamed skirmishes, but for those who fought it, it remained unforgettable. The day the ambush backfired, and American shotguns roared in both triumph and tragedy. The next morning, long after the gunfire had faded, a reconnaissance patrol returned to the ridge. What they found was a frozen scene, empty shell casings glinting in the mud, splintered trees, and a few scattered helmets marking where men had fallen. The jungle had already begun to reclaim its vines, crept over the spent brass and blood-darkened soil, as if the earth itself wanted to erase what had happened. To the surviving Marines, it felt like walking through a place that refused to admit it had been touched by war. 2 of Winfield's men were recovered, one alive. Barely one, not the others, McCready, Ames, and the rest, had been evacuated by boat the evening before, sent back to the island staging area at Inagai. There, under the makeshift palm frond roof of the field hospital. They gave their statements to the battalion intelligence officer. Clipped, weary, and factual. The report was brief. But its implications were not. It confirmed what dozens of previous patrols had hinted: paper-hulled shotgun shells. Even when waxed, were unreliable in tropical conditions. Humidity made them swell. Storage in the field was impossible to control. The shells jammed with lethal frequency. The ordnance notes recommended urgent replacement with brass-cased 12-gauge ammunition for all forward area use. The language was restrained. But behind those words was the quiet anger of men who had seen friends die for preventable reasons. That single ambush, though tactically minor, became part of a growing pattern that reached back through the chain of command, from frontline patrols to the logistics warehouses in Espiritu Santo, and finally to the U.S. Ordnance Department in Washington. By late 1943, the Army and Marine Corps were compiling detailed failure data on small arms performance in tropical theaters: shotguns, Thompsons, carbines, bars. Each weapon was being studied, not just for how it killed, but how it survived. Letters from the Pacific carried a recurring tone. Moisture is the enemy. It rotted rations, jammed weapons, ruined boots, and corroded radios. But for the shotgun, it was uniquely destructive. Unlike the rifle cartridge, a sealed brass unit, impervious to damp, the 12-gauge relied on a compressed paper hull crimped over the shot in civilian life. That shell was perfect, cheap, accurate, and easy to mass-produce in the jungle. It became a liability. Ordnance officers experimented with everything from paraffin coatings to full brass hulls. Factories in Connecticut and Massachusetts shifted some production lines to the sturdier casings. Though brass shortages made it difficult to sustain, every round of brass used for a shotgun meant one less for artillery or rifle ammunition. But the field reports kept coming. Each one reinforced the same truth: paper shells killed men before they could fire them. Winchester and Remington engineers, reading these dispatches, began modifying their own designs. They reinforced extractors, adjusted chamber tolerances, and proposed lighter materials that would resist rust. But the heart of the issue, the ammunition, could only be solved by industry. The Western Cartridge Company began testing moisture-resistant synthetics and varnishes. Yet these would not reach combat units until late 1944, too late for the men on New Georgia. Bougainville or Tarawa. The lessons, though, were absorbed by the time U.S. forces pushed toward Peleliu and Okinawa. Ordnance officers had adapted logistics accordingly. Shotguns were issued in smaller numbers. Ammunition was stored in waterproof tins when possible. Brass shells were prioritized for radar and reconnaissance units, most likely to use them. It wasn't perfection, but it was adaptation, the quiet, grinding evolution that defined the American war machine back at Inagai. Sergeant Winfield's report joined hundreds of others in the division's after-action archive. A small, typed line in black ink summarized the entire ordeal. Enemy patrol ambushed. Friendly losses: 3 killed, 2 wounded. Shotgun jamming due to humidity. Recommend brass shell standardization. It was bureaucratic, almost emotionless, the military's way of turning trauma into data. But every man who read it understood what it meant. A single weapon's flaw had altered a battle's outcome, and for those who had survived, that realization carried a strange kind of clarity, that technology, courage, and survival were inseparable threads in the same story. By September, new crates arrived at island depots marked with stenciled letters: 12-gauge, brass-cased, Lot 43C. The system had responded late, but decisively. The price had already been paid, and while official histories would never name Winfield's squad, their experience lived on quietly in the manuals that followed, in the revised maintenance notes, the waterproof packaging standards, and the small-type footnotes that told future soldiers, "Keep your shells dry." The Red Ball Express of the Pacific wasn't trucks, it was crates. Ships, and bare-handed laborers moving ammunition through rain and heat on Guadalcanal, New Georgia, and Bougainville. Every round fired came through this fragile chain by 1944. Ordnance officers had learned that survival depended as much on logistics as on marksmanship. A dry bullet was as vital as a brave soldier, and nowhere was that more literal than in the case of the shotgun. Reports from multiple regiments confirmed the same pattern. The shotgun, once hailed as a jungle equalizer, had begun to vanish from frontline rosters. It was still loved, still trusted by those who had felt its power, but it became a niche weapon for point men, for tunnel clearers, for sentries in perimeter camps, in ambush work. Commanders grew cautious. The risk of jamming in humidity outweighed its short-range devastation. Rifles and submachine guns now led the line. That shift wasn't a condemnation of the shotgun, it was recognition that every weapon had its climate. The Garand belonged to open hills, the Thompson to urban ruins, the shotgun to the dry barnyards of Kansas or the swamps of Louisiana. Where men first trained with it, in the Pacific, nature itself became the ultimate general, deciding which tools of war would live or die. The industrial response, though quiet, was relentless. In 1944, the Western Cartridge Company introduced a redesigned brass hull with improved crimp. Sealing tested under simulated humidity chambers built in Illinois. These shells, when finally distributed, performed flawlessly in New Guinea and the Philippines. They came too late for many, but they proved that American industry could evolve faster than its own bureaucracy. Behind every new crate was the echo of men like Winfield and McCready, whose reports had forced the change. At the same time, ordnance researchers began studying weapon-environment interaction as a formal science. Humidity tests, salt spray corrosion analysis, long-term metal exposure, all born from lessons of the Pacific. These would shape not just the rest of World War II, but the small arms designs of Korea and Vietnam decades later. The lessons of one jammed shotgun would ripple through generations of warfare, even within the Marine Corps' training doctrine evolved. By 1945, recruits learned how to maintain weapons under tropical strain, cleaning them with gasoline, storing ammo in oilcloth, avoiding over-lubrication that could trap dust or moisture. Field manuals expanded sections on climate discipline, reminding soldiers that survival was a mechanical art as much as a moral one. But the most profound aftermath was psychological. In private letters home, survivors of the jungle campaigns often described their weapons as living things. My rifle sweats. My shotgun breathes heavy. My Thompson feels tired. They had come to understand the fragility of steel in the hands of flesh. War, they realized, wasn't just fought against men, it was fought against time, rust, and rain. For historians, the shotgun story became a symbol of adaptation, a case study in how soldiers and machines learn together. Its failures revealed the unglamorous reality of progress, that innovation is written not in triumphs, but in corrections. Every weapon that failed forced a new one to exist. Every mistake drew a sharper blueprint for the future. By the war's end, roughly 100,000 shotguns had been produced for the U.S. military. Many never left storage depots. Others served with distinction in secondary roles: prisoner guards, shipboard security, or close quarters clearing on Okinawa. A few, like Winfield's and McCready's, survived long enough to return stateside. Those that did often ended up hanging in VFW halls, clean to mirror shine, their scars polished away. But to the men who'd carried them through jungle storms, those dents and rust patches weren't imperfections, they were history, burned into steel. When the Pacific Campaign closed, the Army Ordnance Board published its final report on small arms performance. It contained tables, diagrams, and the usual mechanical language, but buried within it was a single understated conclusion: environmental resistance shall be considered a combat factor equal to firepower. range, and accuracy. It was a quiet revolution in military thought, the first time that weather, water, and temperature were listed as enemies to be fought with the same seriousness as human opponents. For the survivors of New Georgia, that truth needed no paperwork. They had seen it firsthand. The jungle deciding who lived. The shotgun roaring and choking in the same breath. And as they boarded transports home, they carried that duality with them: pride in the weapon's ferocity, respect for its limits, and the quiet knowledge that even the finest machine was mortal. Under tropical rain, the war moved on to new islands, new weapons, new equations of death and endurance. But somewhere in a warehouse, stamped in fading black ink, sat crates marked 12-gauge brass cased, Lot 43C field test approved, a bureaucratic epitaph for one of the most human lessons of the Pacific War. When historians speak of World War II, they measure it in divisions, tonnage, and strategy. But for the men who lived it, the war was measured in inches, the distance between dry steel and rust, between a working shell and a jammed one, between ambusher and survivor. The jungle erased grandeur. It reduced everything to breath, mud, and the faint metallic click of a weapon that might or might not fire. The shotgun was never the hero of the Pacific. It was a brutal, short-range instrument, perfect in its moment, unforgiving beyond it. Yet within that contradiction lay something deeply human. It reflected its operator's own struggle: powerful, adaptable, but always vulnerable to the elements, like the men who carried it. It was both resilient and flawed. The New Georgia ambush faded quickly from reports, lost among hundreds of other clashes that never made it to headlines. But its legacy endured in quieter forms, in the redesigned shell casings, the new maintenance protocols, the unspoken discipline that came from knowing that survival was never just about courage. It was about respect for the weapon, the weather, and the invisible systems that kept both alive in every war. Technology and nature wrestle for control. Sometimes machines win. Sometimes the world reminds them who's older in the jungles of the South Pacific. The rain won more often than not, but from that struggle came evolution, not just of weapons, but of understanding. The shotgun that jammed at New Georgia became more than a weapon. It became a teacher. It taught soldiers that precision engineering means nothing without preparation, that strength demands humility, and that even in the age of machines, war remains an argument between man and environment. And as the Pacific quieted, as rifles were oiled and stored, the echo of those short, violent blasts faded into memory, a reminder that every weapon ever carried tells two stories: how it destroyed and how it endured.